Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Nancy Drew Secret of the Scarlet Hand game review. We hope you're all staying safe amidst the coronavirus crisis going on right now.
You just got us demonetized. Welcome back to the Nancy Drew Game Ambiance Channel Review Series, the series where we are ranking every single Nancy Drew game on 6 key stats, being the story and mystery, the suspects, the puzzles, the music, the ambiance and atmosphere, and the ending. I'm your host, Jameson, and this is my co-host, Julian.
Aloha.
Switching it up. And today we are reviewing Nancy Drew number 6, Secret of the Scarlet Hand. Now, we recently played this through on the channel. I know we say at the end of everything, but I want to emphasize that this one took us a long time, like 3 times as long as any other game has taken us.
The puzzles in this game are quite a step up from the previous games. Difficulty...
I'd say difficulty-wise, to be certain.
Yeah, okay.
Quality-wise, questionably.
The difficulty in this game is a vast step up from the previous games. In the puzzles, and in order to make progress, there's a lot of unwritten things you have to do in order to progress into the game, which is always a big flaw in the early games, and it really shines through in this game, sadly. But
we don't want to get ahead of ourselves or out of order, so how about we go ahead and start off with the premise of the game? You want to take that?
The premise of the game is that Nancy Drew's father's friend, Franklin Rose, is calling Nancy in to help at the Beach Hill Museum in Washington, D.C., where Nancy's going to be a museum curator.
Nancy's job is to help make sure that everything is in order after the disastrous previous curator, known as Hurricane Sunny, tore through the place, messed up a lot of the exhibits, and ultimately put the entire Mayan history exhibition in jeopardy about a week or 2 before the exhibit is supposed to open to the public.
Sonny June
is a... Oh my god.
Finally, we get... I mean, this is his first ever appearance. If you can call it an appearance. This is his first ever intro to any type of game.
Sonny June is an elusive character who you see appearing in cameos all across the rest of the franchise. You don't meet him until game 30, which is... that was a landmark of sorts, but...
In which he's an actual suspect. But.
He's kind of an idiot, but that's what makes him charming. He's just this, we'll get to Sonny when we get to Sonny. It's difficult to describe him.
Sonny deserves his own category of ranking there. So Nancy is working as deputy curator for the museum, which is about to open a grand exhibit for Mayan culture and civilization in about 1 week.
And let me tell you, this game, Nancy Drew games don't always get educational. This game definitely gets educational.
This is arguably the most educational game.
But I hate to say it, but it almost does a good job of making learning fun. I mean,
it does, but at the same time, it's not like you play Nancy Drew to learn something. I mean, it has its place. I appreciate it, but sometimes it gets a little tedious, especially in the very first part of the game.
We should wait until we get the puzzles again.
It's just Nancy Drew does chores, essentially. But.
Yeah, that's something that is important to note about this game, is that this is about one of the only games that goes a very long time. You can be playing this game up to 30 minutes to an hour before there's actually a mystery. So before that happens, you're literally just playing Museum Curator Simulator.
Right, because the story goes is Nancy's called in to work at Beach Hill Museum, and there is no mention of a mystery. Nancy's not acting as a detective, she's solely acting as a deputy curator. Essentially, the game, for the first half hour to an hour, it really is just deputy curator chores. There's no crime to solve.
Until once you reach a certain point on your checklist, the alarms go off, Joanna bursts into the back room and goes, "Nancy Drew, Beach Hill's been hit, settle down, the cavalry's on their way, hoo-ha," something like that. And then police sirens blare, and next thing you know, you're looking at a smashed display case. Somebody has just stolen one of the prize artifacts of the exhibition, a old jade carving of the late Mayan king, King Pakal.
And the reason this game is called Secret of the Scarlet Hand is because once the jade carving is stolen, there is a mysterious red handprint. Once the jade carving is stolen, there is a mysterious red handprint left at the scene of the crime on a single piece of paper.
And it's just
It kind of looks bloody. It's pretty ominous.
as the game progresses, more and more things start to go wrong at the museum. Some characters start to turn on each other, call in tips that may be ill-founded. Looking at you, Alejandro, to get other characters picked up by the police, but on that regard, I think that's about a good segue to move into the suspects. So, who do you want to start with? You can take first suspect, your pick.
I guess I'll kick things off with my favorite suspect. That's Henrik van der Heun. Henrik van der Heun he's the most dynamic suspect in this game. He starts off as he's a pretty bland guy. He's what's his job title?
He's the top epigrapher. I don't know how to pronounce it, but he deals with glyphs. His whole deal is taking a look at Mayan glyphs and trying to decode them and decipher what they mean. Hieroglyphics, like how the ancient Egyptians had, is pretty similar to the form of communication that the Mayans had.
So you start off meeting Henrik in like the laboratory of the museum, and he's hard at work deciphering glyphs on what seems to be ancient Mayan pottery of some sorts, and he starts off as a very bland character, and I always hated, this is just a little pet peeve, is that his shirt is the same color as his skin. It makes him look like he's like he's shirtless, like he's just wearing a lab coat. That choice of very tan beige shirt, it never made sense to me, but he wears a mask over his face, arguably to save on animation so his face never has to move for the first part of the game, but that is subject to change the farther you go into the game. Henrik undergoes quite the change when he stumbles down the great steps of the pyramid in the museum and gives himself a terrible concussion. The rest of the game, Henrik is in a hospital bed that you have to interact with at a hospital completely separate from the museum, and it's a much cooler character shift. You see a completely different side of Henrik and his vulnerabilities to remember what he was working on previously.
He becomes an amnesiac, and you get contacted by a nurse at the hospital who claims that he's muttered your name multiple times in his unconsciousness, which...
Suppose he has absolutely no family then.
Yeah, so...
If Nancy is the only person he can recall.
So your objective at that part of the game is to talk to Henrik and leave pictures on his memory board to try to help jog his memory of what was going on at Beach Hill. And so, let's see, then I guess we should talk about Joanna Riggs. She's the head curator. Joanna has her own office at the museum. Once you first walk into the door, she's on the left side, and she is your head honcho. She's the one that's giving you all of your tasks and chores and telling you where you can find them. Ultimately, a lot of the game is spent crossing off chores on a task list that's in the laboratory with Henrik. But otherwise, Joanna's the one that always sends you there. You talk to her about stuff. She says semper ubi sub ubi like 30% of the time whenever you end a conversation. Some classic Latin.
And then Joanna Riggs disappears in the second half of the game when she is placed under arrest for the robbery of the jade carving at the Beach Hill Museum, which
the police assume it was an inside job after a tip.
Right. That was a really cool little sequence of events. The game goes on so that Nancy has to prove Joanna's innocence, and that was a cool part of the game I liked.
And so, likewise, we should get to the person now who calls in the tip. Alejandro Del Rio of the Mexican consulate. I know Julian doesn't like this guy as much as I do. I think that he's kind of a colorful character. He's a Mexican diplomat. He has diplomatic immunity, so he talks about that every now and again, where he doesn't have to answer any questions to the police and stuff. And he's an interesting character because he carries a pretty cool notion with him about how a lot of artifacts and pieces of art are stolen from their places of origins and then are brought to museums without proper documents of provenance. And so he claims that this is exactly what's been happening with a lot of the artifacts at Beach Hill, so he's not so much sympathetic to the stealing of the jade carving, and he claims that as soon as it left Mexican soil, it was stolen then.
Alejandro Del Rio has a cool tie to being a potential culprit because he's historically motivated. He acts based off of his country, Mexico, and he thinks it's wrong that the jade carving that it was in the museum in the first place. He thinks what does he want? He doesn't want it to be...
He wants it to be repatriated to Mexico.
Yeah, so Alejandro's cool motivation of not wanting the jade carving in Beach Hill whatsoever, he would rather prefer it be in Mexico because that's his homeland. It's a really cool backstory, and it makes for a cool motivation for him to be a culprit. However, I don't know why, he just kind of seems bland the entire time. I think it's because he has a small amount of talking points. There's a lot of untapped potential, to say.
And so finally, that leaves us with the Big Bunny. Yep.
Sonny June. Oh, wait, no.
Taylor Sinclair, not Sonny June. Taylor Sinclair is an art dealer. And as you start to piece together before you even figure out that he is, spoiler alert, the culprit, he's a crook. He's a shady art dealer, kind of bends the rules to get the best prices, get the best artifacts to trade and deal. He's the guy who got the monolith for Beach Hill in the first place, which we haven't mentioned yet. The monolith is a massive pillar of stone that Beach Hill is putting on in their excavation, and it's thought to be thousands and thousands of years old, and it was cherished by the Mayans, and it's just covered in glyphs that they can't even decipher yet. And so the monolith itself is out in the garden. We'll get to the actual environment and atmosphere of the game later, but it's a very, very cool place. Very pretty. There's bird sounds playing on speakers, just noises of the jungle. It's a good time. But Taylor as a character is very flamboyant. He has this ridiculous, almost Salvador Dali mustache. He wears colorful ties and colorful button-up shirts, and he talks like a dad.
Oh, I do not like his dialogue. It's pretty crazy.
He has some really good moments. Like when you talk to Alejandro, and Alejandro accuses Taylor of being a thief and stealing artifacts from Mexico. Taylor responds to this by saying, "Perhaps someday I will tell you the sad story called How Mexico Lost Its Sense of Humor."
Okay, that is the best line in the game.
I always thought that was hilarious how he just writes off art thief as Mexico losing its sense of humor.
Yeah, he's an interesting character.
He offers Nancy Oaxacan cookies that actually become a plot point later.
Want a cookie? They're from Oaxaca. He's a weird character, and he does have a cool motivation for being the culprit, I guess. I mean, it's kind of clear the more you look into it, but I don't know.
We'll get into that at the end.
Yeah, cool character overall, but a little on the creepy side.
Kind of ridiculous. So that brings us into the puzzles segment. Now, we've already said a lot about puzzles in the first place.
So one puzzle that rings out to me is one of the first ones in the game. It's matching up the audio with everything in the museum, and it is a very tedious task.
What I'd say the biggest problem with puzzles in this game is that a lot of them were very poorly explained, because they were all explained by a task list that was just written down in the laboratory. So like if you went to ask someone, what should I do? They say, check your task list, which makes your task list your only recourse to figure out how you solve puzzles.
I believe this was the first invention of the task list.
Technically speaking, it wasn't a task list that Nancy could carry around with her. It was stationary in the lab.
But this was the first game that there was a place that set all the objectives you had to hit.
Yeah, I guess so, but not all the objectives. Oh, Nancy's laptop back at the house, that had, like, notes and stuff on it, too.
Right, that was helpful, but I hate how they were all scattered about. You know, if you needed to refer to the notes and you were in the museum, it was kind of annoying having to travel all the way back to Nancy's hotel.
Yeah, there was a lot of traveling in this game that got to be gear grinding.
So, back to puzzles. It's one of the weakest parts of the game, in my opinion, because the puzzles are they're very educational, very educational based, and not that that's necessarily a bad thing.
They get to be like matching puzzles when you got into the museum. And, like,
yeah, a lot of it is actually guesswork, especially when you get into the pyramid. There's so much guesswork on the puzzles that, I don't know, it just seems very redundant that the puzzles even exist in the first place. Well, Jamie, what's your favorite puzzle in the game?
If I had to pick a favorite puzzle in this game, it'd probably be the ham radio sequence that happens in the second half of the game, where Nancy gets into Henrik's cabinet that's locked and finds a notebook that shows that Henrik was actually in cahoots with smugglers for some of his life, almost incriminating him with the other culprit in the game. So, in this note, you find out that there is a station that's coded on a ham radio, which is a form of communication that archaeologists around the world use that's really remote, and it helps them keep in track, and it's a very hard signal to block or track. So, using the ham radio, you're supposed to use Morse code and translation to Spanish and just some basic math to, like, decipher what numbers you should send them, what codes you should send them, in order to tell these smugglers on the other side of the border that they can ship the package to you, whatever the package is. And once you receive this package, it turns out to be another jade carving, and we'll get into why you need more of them when we get to the end of the game.
The introduction to the smugglers into the storyline was a really cool plot point, I thought. I think that Nancy herself having to interact with the smugglers at that part of the game with the ham radio puzzle, which by the way is my favorite puzzle too. And notice that our favorite puzzle, and I think most of the community would agree, no one's favorite puzzle is an educational one for this game, you know?
Yeah.
I don't think anyone would hands down say, oh, well, my favorite puzzle is the Mayan numeric puzzle.
Yeah, the Mayan numerals where you have to like put them in order.
But back to the ham radio, that was a really cool point, that Nancy has to kind of work underground with these smugglers in order to retrieve information on what's going on with the Mayan jade carvings. I think that was cool.
Yeah. But in that regard, as far as the other puzzles in the game go, there's a lot of talking to people on the phone. There's a lot of just talking to suspects and figuring out stuff they have to say to you.
A big part of the game that has the most puzzles is the pyramid of the museum, which is a really cool feature we're going to touch on when it comes to the atmosphere and ambiance. But the pyramid is segmented off into 3 separate layers. In order to get into each level, you need to do about 3 to 4 puzzles on the current level in order to get down a floor. And that is not my favorite feature. I mean, it kind of gets cooler how you go down deeper and deeper, but a lot of the puzzles were just annoying. Like
some of them
quizzes,
puzzles that you couldn't even beat because you get to it and it would say like, what is the answer to this puzzle? And it's by Sunny June. And then there's a note from Henrik that says, Sunny, remove this immediately. No one's gonna know what this answer is.
Yeah. The majority of the puzzles in order to progress deeper into the pyramid were matching based. And I'm never a fan of those types of puzzles. Other ones include completely randomized, what was the one? The basketball type one, where you're shooting.
It's a reskin of like the skipping rocks at the bottle in Deception Island, and
yeah, this was not a good puzzle, nor was the one in Danger in Deception Island. But that's just another shiny example of how the puzzles, they stand out as being inferior in this game compared to others.
They appear to be kind of lazy. So
that's actually a good word. If I had to pick one word to describe puzzles in this game, it would probably be lazy.
So this brings us to the music of this game now. Now this game, I feel like
it
has
had good music.
It's underrated music, to say the least.
I do really like the music in this game, especially the basic theme that's played throughout exploring the museum. It's kind of cheerful. It's like energetic, and I think that was a nice touch they played on a rather droll experience when it comes to learning things throughout the museum. Is at least you had this kind of cheerful music to rely on.
There's a pretty consistent theme in this game of having Mexican music and Mexican culture, because with the whole Mayan theme at the exhibit. But one thing that just never made sense to me was that the game takes place in Washington, D.C., and you do virtually nothing in the game that has to do with it being in Washington, D.C. I feel like it wouldn't make much sense for the game to take place somewhere down south, like Arizona or New Mexico. But it doesn't. It takes place in the Midwest, so...
Yeah, that's a good point. This game could be... We could be having a completely different review right now if this game took place in Mexico. Can you imagine that?
That'd be so cool. I mean, there wouldn't be the whole subplot with things getting expatriated out of Mexico.
That's true.
But
Alejandro's character would need to be reworked.
It could just be anywhere but the big city, because like there are 0 outdoor locations in this game. That's something to note, because I usually enjoy when locations get to be outside, because it gives a whole new layer of atmosphere. And I guess the closest you get in this game is the garden in the museum, which has a lot of really cool puzzles and bird sound effects and stuff, but there's only so much to do there.
Going back on the music,
there's some themes that literally just have like Mayan Gregorian chanting in them or something.
Yeah, that typically plays when you're in or around the pyramid, and the garden has its own theme, come to think of it. I would not call the music in this game bad at all.
I don't think there's a single track I would call bad. Kevin Mante does such a good job with most of the music in this franchise, and this is no exception.
It's very fitting to the culture, the Mayan culture. Well, let me restart that sentence. The music is very fitting with the Mayan culture, and the entire theme of this game being that in a museum, I think it worked very well. Moving on to the atmosphere and ambiance of the game. It's, in my opinion, along with the music, a shining point, because the museum itself, Beach Hill, I think if we're being honest with ourselves, it's a cool museum that you would want to go to if it were real.
Here's what I have to say. The museum is really cool. Everywhere else in the game, Nancy's hotel room, the Mexican consulate, Taylor Sinclair's office, and the hospital.
Very lackluster.
It's so boring. It's literally just single room places. There's nothing to look in, no bookshelves to look in. Maybe in the Mexican consulate there's like some flyers or pamphlets you can pick up and look at, but there's nothing to note.
It's as if Her Interactive put 80% of their production team onto the Beach Hill Museum, and then it clearly shows in the rest of the game where, as Jamie said, every other location is a single room. And it's very clear that not that much work went into other places of the game.
Come to think of it, this is the first Nancy Drew game where Nancy just stays in a hotel room, I guess, besides Royal Tower if you count that, because the whole game is the hotel.
Right, I wouldn't count that. And the hotel room is not glamorous by any means. It's copy and pasted beige walls, and I want to focus more on the museum because it's where 80% of the game takes place after all. The museum has 3 distinct parts. There's the galleries section that has most of the Mayan artifacts on display. You move back into the museum and there's the cool garden exhibit where there's a lot of statues. It's where the monolith is. It's a little tough to navigate it's like a really weird snaking trail that
there's flaming torches, there's pebble trails and gravel all over the place.
It's a really cool environment. And
there's
then
all sorts of exotic bird calls and everything playing on the speakers and just insects.
The last location, and in my opinion the coolest, especially the deeper you go down into it, is the pyramid.
The pyramid is sweet. You walk up the steps. It's a model of like an actual Mayan pyramid that you'd see in like your history textbooks. And you climb up the steps to the front of it, and you're on the top floor where there's just about 3 puzzles you have to do up there. And then the door opens, and then you get to the second floor, and you get to the third floor. And by the time you get to the third floor, everything is just really cool. There's like a rope bridge that you get to walk across.
It's really dark down there, muted colors, and by floors we're going downstairs. The first floor is at the very top, the peak of the pyramid, and then the floors go down lower and lower to the base of the pyramid. And the deeper you go down, it gets pretty dark. It's very muted colors, a lot of blacks, browns, grays. The other 2 rooms of the museum that Nancy spends a lot of time in is the laboratory where Henrik initially is for the beginning part of the game, and then there's also the
shipping and receiving room.
Right, the shipping and receiving room, which is just a bunch of little nothing too crazy goes on in there.
It's where you receive shipments that you get throughout the game. But otherwise, just again, everywhere but the museum is just lame, but the museum is really, really cool, and it's where you spend most of the game. So, on that regard, we are moving into the ending of the game. We're going to get into even more spoiler territory. There's a lot to touch up on it here, so how about we pick up where...
We have to pick up on how there's 6 pieces.
Okay, so we'll start off with Henrik being in the hospital. Henrik confides in you that he recognizes the Scarlet handprint and says that he is the original author of the work of the glyphs that are on it, and that Joanna translated them wrong. She translated them as the magician suffers yellow death or something. Mm-hmm. Joanna kind of sucks at deciphering glyphs. But Henrik tells you what they really mean, and it's something about the fool instead of the magician, and it's referring to the Copan fool, which was an ancient journalist who wrote a hit piece on King Pakal. And the whole story of the game is that it turns out that this monolith that you have might actually be hollow, and that it's a tomb. And it is a tomb where King Pakal imprisoned a journalist, an ancient Mayan journalist, who wrote a bad story about him and his mother, Lady Zack Cook, and said that they were not actually divinely chosen to rule the Mayan throne. And so the rest of the game then becomes about hunting down 6 jade pieces, one of which being the jade piece that was stolen, because we believe that when you put them all together, they will actually make an ancient key of some sorts to open up the monolith.
This was a really cool idea, and I'm happy that they went with hunting down this. I think it was a cool choice to go with hunting down 5 other pieces of the Mayan artifacts that they're honestly all around the world. This is where another big phone contact, Prudence Rutherford, comes into play.
Yeah. She reappears in other games. I believe she actually hires you to investigate in game 18, Phantom of Venice.
Mm-hmm.
But
she comes. Isn't she in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull too?
No, that's you're thinking.
I'm thinking of Hotchkiss.
Yeah. So that would have been 17 and 18 in a row. People wouldn't be able to stomach that. But anyways, real quick, let's just run down where you find each artifact piece. So first, the piece that is stolen, actually, it wasn't stolen in the first place, but Henrik knew that somebody would be coming for it. It was Taylor, and conveniently he got amnesia, otherwise he would have been able to tell us that when he fell down the pyramid. But Henrik took the piece and hid it in the bottom floor of the pyramid where the puzzles would stop people from getting to it. And Nancy eventually finds it towards the end of the game. Then we have Prudence Rutherford's piece. Her jade heirloom amulet was stolen by the same robber. He left the same red handprint at her estate. And I'm not sure if Taylor himself was the burglar or if,
It's probably an organized crime ring because, there's smugglers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But Taylor's one of the head honchos of this crime ring. And so Prudence Rutherford sends you a mold, or sends you a cast replica that her insurance company made for her to wear that she thinks is an insult, so she gladly sends it to you so long as you don't insult the corn growers ball and call it a barn dance. If you do, then you have to call her back and apologize to her for her help in the game. So that's kind of awkward. Then the Chaco Canyon Cultural Center, which is another museum that got hit and had this piece stolen, they offered to send you a tightly constructed styrofoam mold that they transported there, which they send to you, and then Nancy uses it to make a cast of the mold, which essentially just makes a white carbon copy of the piece. Let's see, we have two.
Another one is interacting directly with the smugglers, right? Nancy has to pose as one of the smugglers herself.
This is the ham radio puzzle. Yeah, I forgot about that one.
The best puzzle in the game. Nancy has to disguise herself as a smuggler, in which she
just uses the ham radio, pretending that she's Henrik, and just sends the go-ahead code saying that the coast is clear, you can send the package, and sure enough, 3 days later, a package arrives at the museum where Nancy gets another Pakal piece. And it's in a puzzle box, but it's very easy to solve.
That was a really cool, probably my favorite one of the jade carvings to receive was that one.
And then finally,
Dada.
we have Penelope, I forget what her name is, but Penelope Daddle. So this is an interesting story where Taylor, the art dealer, has in his office a painting by a young, extravagant artist who goes by the name Poppy Dada, and he's constantly flexing it. I have a Poppy Dada, and you don't. Look at my Poppy Dada. He doesn't shut up about it, ever. And so later on in the game, you make a phone call to a man named Henry Daddle in response to a jade carving that he apparently got into the family in the late 1800s at an auction, and he says that he gave it to his daughter Penelope as an heirloom of some sort, and then he gives you her number and you call her, and it turns out that Penelope Daddle is now Poppy Dada, and you talk to her for a bit, and she's like, "Oh, so you're a detective? Why is my dad on the FBI's most wanted and stuff like that?" And eventually she tells you that she actually put the carving on one of her paintings, the one titled "Deadly Midnight Snack" that Taylor has.
And how ironic is that Taylor, the art thief, is unknowingly
harboring the one piece he's looking for. I never even considered that.
Yeah, that was a cool thing.
It's the funniest slap to your face the way you get rid of it is she tells you to just replace it with something organic so he doesn't know it's gone. And she even tells you, don't take any of those lard biscuit Oaxacan cookies he keeps on offering you, because his trip to Oaxaca was 3 years ago.
And the way that you end up getting the jade carving is that you end up finally agreeing to a cookie. Taylor eats one and claims that he has to use the restroom urgently. So he sprints out of the room to use the restroom, obviously getting sick from eating this Oaxacan cookie. Nancy then takes the Oaxacan cookie. She takes the cookie and replaces it with the jade carving on Taylor Sinclair's painting in his office.
And it's almost funny to note that Nancy's straight up breaking the law every now and again in this case.
Hey, it's for the greater good.
She's just becoming a vigilante at this point. So anyhow, once you get and then you get the key frame. I forget where you find that, or maybe that's what the smugglers send you. You put them all together in the pottery zone in the laboratory and make them into a key, and you take them over to the monolith after you apply some silicon calendar stones to it, and you put them together in a trial and error puzzle ultimately. I don't know if there's like a way you're supposed to tell how you do it, but it's so much easier to just trial and error it. And when you complete it, the puzzle opens up, the monolith opens up, and there is a mummified skeleton sitting in there with a scroll in his hands. And then
none other than Taylor Sinclair comes out of nowhere.
Who's your friend, Nancy? And then
Yeah.
he pushes you forward into it, and like the skeleton lunges at your face because you lunge towards it. It's almost like a jump scare.
Yeah. Taylor Sinclair goes on to take the scroll out of the mummy's hands. That this is the treasure that he's been looking for the entire time, apparently. And then he goes on to lock Nancy in the monolith, in which we have it's a pretty difficult game over
intense
sequence.
puzzle.
Nancy's losing oxygen as she's closed inside this monolith.
Real quick, what Taylor was taking was the actual scroll that the Whisperer had, or not the Whisperer. Did they call him that? I forget.
I don't know.
Okay, well, he took the scroll that the Copan Fool had, which was his hit piece on King Bakal, a thousands-year-old hit piece that is lost to time that would make like huge impacts in Mayan culture about what were people saying about this king that the kings didn't want written down. And so in this place, you find out that was actually the fake scroll and that there was a real one behind the king. You fiddle around with some puzzles, and eventually you get the door open, and if you don't in time, then Nancy actually suffocates in it. And it shows you a newspaper from like 1,000 years in the future.
I forgot that.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. You know how most of the time in the games when you die, like if in Deception Island, if you bike without a helmet, it says careless teen sleuth lands in the hospital after not wearing a helmet on her bike. Yeah, in this one, it just shows a newspaper clipping that's dated like 3087 or something. And, oh my god.
But after Nancy, the key is Nancy has to use a glow stick, like a glowing rock type thing, because it's pitch black inside the monolith. She's looking around frantically as she's losing oxygen, being trapped inside here. And then she actually finds the real scroll that has the real scoop on King Bakal back then.
She opens the door, and she gets a breath of fresh air, and then there's just a really awkward sequence with
every other suspect learns how to use teleportation.
They just show up outside the monolith. Henrik, Joanna, and Alejandro.
Now, I have a problem with this.
Apparently Henrik has his memory back, too.
Yeah, very corny lines are said out of all three of them, but
they recite a poem or something.
Why would they not try to help Nancy get out of here? Are they just listening to Nancy beg for help and lose oxygen? What the heck was going on here? And how did they get here so quickly? There's so many questions I have for this endgame that it really does not make much sense.
Man. But they recite this poem, and then it cuts to
a really it's a cool cinematic of Taylor Sinclair in his office, smirking, laughing as he's unraveling the ancient scroll.
Evil maniacal laughter.
To find out that it's blank, because Nancy was the one who found the real scroll after she was trapped inside the monolith thanks to Taylor.
And he just goes, "What in the world?" And he just has the most anguished look on his face and goes, "Ah! Curse you, Nancy Drew!" And then the endgame letter reads, and everything's resolved. Taylor gets life. I don't know.
Yeah, that was... wow. That was a lot that went on there in the endgame. A very jam-packed ending.
Yeah.
Now, all in all, I don't know how to rank this game. There's so much to take into account, but...
Let's just go ahead and rip the Band-Aid off. What are the things it does wrong the worst?
The puzzles. Every other location other than the museum, the end game was not that well done.
I don't think there's a single puzzle you ever do anywhere that's not in the museum. I mean, you have to, take the floppy disks and stuff that you find back to Nancy's computer and figure out the passwords to those, but that's hardly a puzzle. Literally every puzzle in this game takes place in the museum. Everywhere else is just for talking to characters. It's a really weird, divided dynamic.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes interacting with Henrik in the hospital, I don't know. Yeah, but you're right. I think the entirety of the game's puzzles are done at the museum.
A lot of the characters are hit or miss, but they have grown on me over the years, but I don't think many other people are inclined to like him.
No character shines out to me in this game. Henrik Vanderheun is my favorite. I think he's fun, and I like his character transformation he undergoes. And more importantly, I really, really liked the idea of he was the one that stole the Mayan Pakal artifact.
Yeah.
That was a nice touch.
That was interesting.
But, for that reason, he's my favorite, and then no other character is that redeemable, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's make an attempt to rate this game. What do you give it, Jamie? Break
Alright.
down the tier system and give it a rating.
It's gonna be, the way that these tiers work is A through F, A, B, C, D, F. And, if it's a really, really good game, it belongs in the S tier for Supreme, which is above A, but let's be honest, this game doesn't belong anywhere near there. I would say it's easily worse than all 3 other games we've reviewed for before this one. It's probably the worst game in 3 through 10, maybe.
Yeah, possibly.
And I think I'm gonna have to give it a weak C.
I'm inclined to give it a D+.
Okay, a D and a C. What makes you like it less than me? The reason that I'm like giving it something better than a C, but better than a D, is probably just because of how once you learn how to manage some puzzles in this game, you know what to do. You can kind of work your way through it.
I've never had the urge to sit down and play this game. I don't know anyone who actually has before.
Doesn't the community really like this one?
I've read some really positive reviews about this game. So.
Inexplicably, what do they say?
I don't know. Everyone has their games that they love, I guess. I respect if people like this game. I wouldn't call it a bad game despite my D+ review, but there's just way too many negatives than positives. It's one of those
a bad
games.
game, and I gave it a higher review than you did.
I wouldn't call it a bad game, but there are far too many negatives that outweigh the positives.
Alright, we'll say this. If you are a fan of this franchise, you will find something in it that you enjoy. And if you've never played a Nancy Drew game and you start with this one, then you probably won't play anymore.
Yeah, this is a terrible game to start off with. That's a good point, Jamie. If this was your first Nancy Drew game, it'll also be your last.
Well, anyhow, that concludes our review for Nancy Drew's Secret of the Scarlet Hand. We recently finished a 2-part upload of us beating this game because the first part, which was 3.5 hours, took a long time because we couldn't figure out the stupid numbering puzzle with like the transmissions and the
audio puzzle.
Yeah, the audio puzzle, yeah. And then the second part took us another 2 hours. So this game took us nearly 6 hours total to beat. Aren't we proud of that?
Yeah. I
So-
mean, hey, we got it done.
Anyhow, that's enough Nancy Drew noises to keep you busy for days on end. Maybe 3 hours if you're Sylvia Puppysticker. But in other news, I think that wraps up this review. Stay tuned for the Shadow Ranch long play and the Ghost Dogs review. We got a lot to say about Ghost Dogs. That was probably the second game we ever played.
Oh yeah, looking forward to that one.
Tons and tons of nostalgia.
Thanks for watching, everybody. It means a lot to us. Remember to hit the subscribe button, like the video, and comment which videos you want to see in the future.
And vote for Holt.